Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 248. This week the questions are taken from guides 300 and 301, that's on HMS Spartan and the French Bougainville class avisos, and then the Wednesday videos on Cordite and Poudre B, and Naval Darwin Awards when IQ is inversely proportional to displacement. So let's begin. Nigel Smith asks, as an aircraft model maker, I'd be interested if you could find information on the type of aircraft, crew and unit related to the sinking of HMS Spartan. Well, the aircraft that sank HMS Spartan was almost certainly a Dornier 217E5 of the second group of Kampfgeschwader 100, so 2-KG100. as they seem to be the only ones operating in the area with HS-293s on at the time that Spartan was sunk, and they have kill credits for quite a number of aircraft. So actually, if you want to portray an aircraft attacking various ships during the late January, early February period off Anzio, it's going to be 217s of KG-100, specifically the second group of KG-100, that are going to be the primary offenders. There were some elements of Kampfgeschwader 40 there, but they don't seem to have been as heavily involved in and around the dates that Spartan was sunk, so it's almost certainly Kampfgeschwader 100. This is obviously a Dornier 217E5, not necessarily of that particular Kampfgeschwader or in that particular camo scheme. Josh Thomas Moore asks, the frying pan mounts on the QEs and Illustriouses, etc., what are their official names? The classic pancake that you can see here on this HMS Renown, which is parked in World of Warships, and you'll find on Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and the Illustrious class, is known as the Mark II BD mount, the BD standing for Between Decks. Now, most commonly when you see Royal Navy gun mountings of this approximate size of 4, 4.5, 4.7, 5.25, etc., you'll see them with either a BD or UD indication. So BD, like these, between deck mount, means that part of the turret's rotating assembly pierces the deck. Now, obviously, this does make things a little bit more complicated because you have to have a turret dash barbette sized ring, which is a hole in the deck for the turret to sit in. Now, the offset of that complication is the fact that, as you can see with these, the turret can then be much lower profile and have less of a effect on stability on the ship, whereas a UD mount is an upper deck mount, which is where the entire rotating assembly of the gun, apart from the hoists, is all above deck. So that means you only need to pierce the deck for the hoist system, which is obviously a lot less complicated and usually weighs slightly less because most UD mounts tend to be open-backed, although not all of them. And so most destroyer gun mounts are UD, whereas most capital ship mounts are BD, but that's not necessarily the case going either way. For example, HMS Ark Royal has UD mounts, even though she has the same 4.5-inch gun. It's a slightly different mounting system to what you'd see in some of the later ships. One of the big advantages of a BD mount in something like Renown, as you can see here, is that because they are such low profile, you can see that the guns don't have to elevate very high in turrets next to each other in order to be able to fire over the nearby gun mounting, which is quite useful because it means you then don't have to set up super firing arrangements like you do with, say, the 5.25-inch. And, okay, yeah, you can't fire flat horizontal with your entire battery, but you can cover a good chunk of the airspace without the need for additional stability issues raising the turrets higher. Flamey Wind has a ton of questions, mostly about the Japanese Navy, so I'm going to try and rapid-fire answer some of them and put the questions up on the screen for you to read rather than read them all out. Yes, shells were visible in the air and they did seem to glow. I did cover this in a previous question. It's not really to do with air friction, they're not moving that quickly. It's mostly to do with some shells would actually have some kind of effectively tracer unit in the backs for them to be spotted by, but also just the heat of the shells being fired does seem to have imparted at least some shells with a glow, because there are accounts from ships that definitely didn't have that kind of unit, which still describe them firing at night and watching their shells glow through the sky, and some photographic evidence thereof. Japanese coloured shells on detonation looked like big plumes of water that had a bunch of colour to them. It wasn't cartoonishly virulent, but you could tell at a fair distance that's a reddish shaded splash, that's a yellow shaded splash, that's not a shade, that's just a white splash. And if the water landed on you, you got covered in a lot of very, very heavily dyed water. If you define flak by anti-aircraft shell that is fired up in the sky and then explodes at a preset point, then yes, the Japanese did have flak, but the mechanically timed fuse that was used for these kinds of airbursts is not something you can fit on a 25mm shell or something like that. Certainly not back in those days. And so it would only be their heavier guns, so 100mm and 127mm guns, etc., that would mount this timed fuse for anti-aircraft flak bursts, if you like. Visibility from a ship depends very much on where you are on the ship. Obviously, if you're up in a spotting position high up on a mast, you can see a lot further than you can down on the deck. And of course, bigger ships tend to have larger masts and superstructures, so you can see further still. On a clear day, obviously weather could interfere quite significantly, but on a clear day with the right equipment, high-power binoculars or something, you could see to the horizon and beyond, to the point that the Earth's curvature could become an issue. So you could see, say, the masts and upper superstructure of an enemy ship rising above the horizon, even if you couldn't see the rest of it. Exactly when you could recognise exactly what ship you were looking at depended very much on the size of the ship, its angle, and how distinctive its profile was. The big red circle on the Japanese flight decks, otherwise known I think as a Hinomaru, I think that's how it's pronounced, is confirmed to have been on Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu at the Battle of Midway. It seems that they were applied just before the Battle of Midway. There doesn't seem to be any indication that Taiho, Zuikaku, Shokaku, Unryu or Shinano had them. They seem to have been present relatively briefly, although during the time they were present, they weren't unique to Japanese aircraft carriers. There are a number of battle cruisers, battleships, and cruisers that have been photographed with one of these big red circles somewhere on their hull, or turrets, or decks. The Japanese did get radar towards the mid to latter part of the war, but technologically speaking, their radar development was somewhat behind the Western Allies. So they were still limited to what was essentially air search radar that had a secondary surface search and ranging function at a time when Allied ships had dedicated long-range air search and surface search radars, short-range air and surface search radars, and gunnery control radars for high-angle and low-angle gunnery, amongst other things. And the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance had long gone before World War II, so the Japanese couldn't exactly borrow anything from the British immediately beforehand. The ranges that almost any gun engagement took place at in World War II were far too long to aim for specific parts of enemy ships. You were lucky to just hit an enemy ship in general. Some very close range engagements, and obviously what counts as very close range depends on what kind of ship you're using, occasionally would have them attempt to target a certain portion of a ship, but it was incredibly rare and in incredibly unique circumstances. Otherwise, it's, as I said, it's just a case of, well, we're lucky if we hit the ship at all. Yes, ships very much did often dodge torpedoes. Sometimes they would see them being launched, usually spot an air launch rather than a surface or sub-launch, although surface launch spotting was also known. The visibility of torpedo wakes varied by the torpedo. A long lance essentially had almost no wake. If the seas are very high and choppy, spotting the wake is more difficult. If the seas are somewhat calm and there's not, foaming crests of waves and so forth, then spotting the torpedo wakes of something that isn't a long lance is considerably easier. The main problem you have is that where you will spot a torpedo wake, assuming that the torpedo is running at speed and at the correct depth, is going to be somewhat behind the torpedo, unless the torpedo is doing something dodgy like surface running. And so you have to try and guesstimate roughly where the torpedo actually is. But since on a good day with decent visibility, you could spot a torpedo at several thousand yards, you would have a chance to try and dodge. but as I said, a lot of the time the torpedo dodging that went on whilst dodging via the wakes was definitely done. A lot of it was done because they'd seen the torpedo be launched in the first place, and so they knew that, well, if the enemy's calculations were in any way accurate, they just needed to be not in the place that they were going to be when that torpedo launch occurred. So yeah, that's just a little short burst of multiple questions. Let me know how that format works. I'm not going to do it very often, and I didn't cover quite all of the questions that Flamey Wind asks, but I thought it would be an interesting experiment to run. Vicky asks, how effective would something along the lines of the Disney bomb have been as a dive-bomber-borne anti-warship weapon? On the face of it, the extra acceleration provided by equipping the bomb with rocket motors would seem to solve the problem that occasionally cropped up in World War II, where in order to be sure of actually hitting the ship, dive bombers ended up having to release their bombs at heights too low for the bombs to gain enough speed to penetrate the ship's armoured deck. I suspect it would be a relatively effective way of improving the armour-piercing potential of dive bombs released a little bit too low, as you mentioned during Operation Tungsten, for instance. My main concern would be twofold. Firstly, if you're going to attach a rocket motor to the dive bomber's payload, that's going to substantially increase the weight of the bomb that the dive bomber is carrying, and since most, not all dive bombers, but most of them are single-engined aircraft, you may have to simultaneously reduce the size of the warhead itself. Now, that may not always be the case, but I think you're probably going to find that some of the bombs would have to become a little bit smaller. Now, with the extra acceleration from the rocket motor, that may not matter. So, a 1,600-pound bomb dropped by a Barracuda, as opposed to a rocket-powered 1,000-pounder. The rocket-powered 1,000-pounder, assuming it's got 600 pounds of rocket strapped to the back of it, it's probably actually going to go in further, so fair enough. But if you've got a plane that is, say, only capable of carrying a 1,000-pounder, then basically at that point maybe carrying a 500-pounder with rockets on it might not result in quite the level of damage you necessarily want it to do. And an aircraft that can only carry a 500-pounder, well, if you're going to do a 250-pounder with a rocket, yeah, I'd probably reckon that's not really worth it so much. But it's a potentially viable option, those concerns aside. The other concern I would have is how and when the rockets are going to activate, because if you're putting a bunch of fairly impressive rockets and you're using it mostly to compensate for a dive bomber that's releasing its payload a little bit late, although the increased speed might also make up for a bit of accuracy, you are going to have to be very, very careful about when exactly those rockets ignite, because if you ignite either whilst the bomb is attached to or a little bit too close to the aircraft, you might damage or destroy the aircraft that has just dropped the bomb. If they light up a little bit too late, then of course they're not going to have as much, if any, acceleration effect before the bomb hits the ship. So you'd have to time it very carefully, both the release and the maneuver that the dropping aircraft does immediately afterwards. But if you can address those concerns, then actually you might have a pretty effective weapon for low-level attacks on armoured ships. Next we have pretty much all coal-fired warships use their coal bunkers as essentially additional armour. This seems, at least at first, like it would be a terrible idea, as coal has a tendency to create dust, which one would think would give it the exact opposite effect of armour, since an incoming shell that penetrates into the coal bunkers and exploding would loft huge quantities of highly flammable coal dust into the air, followed by a much larger explosion as a coal bunker-sized fuel air bomb that's just come into being ignites. How did coal-fired warships make it so their coal bunkers actually helped to protect the ship rather than helped blow it up? To be fair, the idea originated back when the armour-piercing ammunition that was being shot at ships was solid shot. There was a distinction between shot and shell, shell being effectively what we would now call high explosive, and the armour-piercing round being just a solid lump of metal. But obviously once explosive shells came in, they did retain the idea of the coal bunkers as partial armour, or improvements and supplements to the existing iron, steel, compound, Harvey or Krupp armour. Now, the issue with coal dust potentially could be a thing, but It's not quite as bad as you might suppose. And the other thing is coal does provide a fair degree of resistance. Not obviously nowhere near as much as steel, but there's a lot more coal, at least when the bunkers are full. And stopping the shell short, even if it explodes in the coal bunker, is considered a much better alternative than the shell exploding in the machinery spaces or in the ship's magazines. So you've got to take that into account. The other thing is, as you can see from this diagram, the coal bunkers tend to be usually below the waterline or only just above it. So a shell that penetrates the armour and reaches the coal bunker is almost certainly also going to emit a bunch of water, which is going to have a rather damping effect on any coal dust that may otherwise cause something of an issue when either the shell explodes or hot fragments, etc., might cause that to ignite. And to be honest, it's most likely to be, if you were going to get a coal dust air explosion, it would most likely be hot fragments from the shell exploding, because the explosion itself is probably what's going to aerosolize the coal dust, and then subsequent to that, hot shrapnel might set it off, but there'd be an intervening time period during which water ingress would probably damp everything down. Crazy Penguin asks, it's commonly stated that British battlecruisers during World War I removed their flash protection to improve their rate of fire, but I don't think I've ever seen this backed up by source material. An explanation I have heard is that it was most likely a verbal order, because that's generally how BT was, but surely such an order would be so obviously dangerous that it's inconceivable that not one of the dozens of people, all the way down from the ship's captain to the first officer, turret commanders, etc., would acknowledge this and just go along without a written order, or at least they might put their own concerns into writing. Is there any written source material for such an order existing? This is one of those slightly nebulous issues that has to be reconstructed from sources around the issue rather than directly. I'm not aware specifically of a direct order where, from Vice Admiral Beatty to Captain's Battlecruiser Fleet, remove your flash protection to increase rate of fire. As far as I know, that doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's not been found yet. There are orders to seek to increase the rate of fire. There's at least one I can think of that I'm paraphrasing because I don't have an exact copy in front of me, but it essentially is kind of endeavour to increase rate of fire by all means possible. So it's that kind of inference, the saying it without directly saying it aspect, and how far does everybody take it? Because, of course, if you say by any reasonable means possible, or words to that effect, well, if something goes catastrophically wrong, then clearly that crew was being unreasonable in their efforts, and the blame doesn't fall on you, which is a very BT-like manoeuvre. Nonetheless, we do then, subsequent to Jutland, have some orders pinging around that talk about reinstatement and reinstalling of anti-flash measures, and you wouldn't send an order around that tells everyone to make sure all your anti-flash measures are in fact in place if at least some ships had less than what they should have had on paper as their anti-flash measures, so that's a supposition, but a fairly strong one, because, it's kind of like, as people were pointing out on the video from the tour of USS Iowa, where there's that box of ammunition that says, do not weld boxes full of live ammunition, there's a bit of a story behind why you'd say that in the first place. And then you also have the fact that there are multiple potential causes of the explosions at Jutland, and from the other records that have survived, there's also very different cases on very different ships. So you have the famous letters and accounts written by Gunner Grant of HMS Lion, who's trying to clear up Lion's Act in the run-up to the Battle of Jutland. You also have an officer who was aboard HMS Agincourt, which, interestingly enough, is in the battle fleet, not the battlecruiser fleet, but he is appalled when he sees ammunition, specifically charges, scattered all over the place. Extra charges in the turrets, extra charges in the handling rooms, extra unboxed or unbagged or uncased charges in the magazines. Agincourt didn't have the world's best armour in the first place, but if there was ever a ship that we can actually verify probably would have gone up like a Catherine wheel if she had been hit anywhere vital, it would have been Agincourt. Of course, the ships that were hit and exploded, the explosion tends to remove most of the evidence of what's going on, which makes it a little bit difficult to then work out what happened subsequently. There is some evidence of unexploded cordite scattered around some of the wrecks. Defence and Invincible come to mind, for instance. But the thing is, just because there is unexploded cordite in, say, a turret or in a working passage, that doesn't mean that therefore there wasn't a cordite explosion up there. Because remember, the cordite charges, they come in these cases, and the cases, at least the ones that are in most common use in the Royal Navy in World War I, are somewhat biodegradable. So if you find a cordite charge scattered around in a turret, it could mean potentially that there wasn't an explosion in the turret. It could also mean that that particular charge just happened to be in its case, and therefore the flash didn't consume the charge. But over time, either the shock of the explosion, the forces involved in the sinking, or just simple biodegradation have removed that case from the charge, and now you just have a charge lying around. And then, of course, you can have whole sets of combinations of factors. It's not necessarily one common factor all along in all cases on Invincible, Indefatigable, Queen Mary, Defence, etc. It could be that in some cases the explosions are down to one cause, in other cases explosions are down to another cause, and potentially combinations of causes. We have, as I've mentioned, a number of different ways that theoretically could have happened, but only documentation that it very definitely was happening in specific ways, or the danger was present in specific ways on specific ships. And then other options could be more dangerous across more ships. Scott asks, is there any data available on the differences in loadout of British ships in World War I? Specifically, how many rounds of ammunition and their charges would be on board a given ship, both in peacetime and in war, perhaps when they were in dock, when they were cruising, when they were showing the flag, etc., and how might different load conditions and temperatures, etc., affect the formation of nitroglycerin crystal dust? There is a fair amount of data, but of course the data varies on a ship-by-ship basis, because not all ships carry the same amount of ammunition in their design loadout. So some ships are designed for 80 rounds per gun, some ships are designed for 100 rounds per gun during the time period that we're talking about, and so on and so forth. But if a ship is in dock, if it's in dry dock, for instance, usually if it's going into dry dock, it will actually land all of its ammunition before it does so. If a ship is cruising, showing the flag, peacetime operations, they usually won't carry a full warload of ammunition. They might carry a reasonable amount, but again, it depends what they're doing and where they're going, how long they're expected to be away for. So if they're going on a long distance cruise to an overseas station, they might actually carry near a full warload, but they might have a decent preponderance of practice shells aboard, whereas if they were going to war, it would be almost entirely, if not entirely, live ammunition. If they're going on a specific showing of the flag tour, so it has a overall shorter duration and they know exactly where they're going, then they might only carry, say, a half load of ammunition to make not necessarily space, but make displacement weight for other things they might need for that specific tour. And even when they're in wartime, things could vary because, as I mentioned, ships were designed to carry certain amounts of ammunition. We know in the run-up to World War I that the Royal Navy was looking at, specific admirals were looking at trying to increase the ammunition loadout of British ships, but the magazines have been designed to hold a certain amount of rounds and a certain amount of charges. So one of the things that was implemented across quite a few ships was the installation of shell lockers and charge hold containers in the working chamber, which is why this diagram is here. So the working chamber is the chamber immediately below the gun house of the turret, where shells, at least in British battleship design at this period, are coming up from the magazines, and then they are exchanged at that level for a shorter hoist, which will take it up to the gun itself. This is actually a form of safety because it means there's theoretically not a direct unbroken path all the way down to the magazines. But of course, if you stock this area full of shells and cordite charges, well, especially the cordite charges, that's going to be something of a safety hazard. The flip side, of course, being that in theory, those would be the first rounds you fired off, so you should empty that chamber pretty quickly. And we have plans of the working chambers showing those adjustments. So we know that that definitely did happen on a fair number of vessels. Now, when it comes to temperatures, obviously the cooling systems down in the magazines, they only have a certain capacity. So, I mean, even with a modern refrigerator, if you take a modern refrigerator and you stick it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, it's very, very unlikely to be able to get down to the same temperature level that you could get it to work its way down to in, say, the UK in the middle of winter. And then, of course, if you take it up to the Arctic, the refrigerator's more of a warming device than anything else, but that's another matter. So bear in mind, you're talking about much more limited refrigeration systems back then. If a ship is, say, stationed in Scapa Flow, it's probably not going to have too much of a problem keeping the cordite in its magazines down to a nice chilly temperature. But if you deploy that same ship to the Mediterranean or to the Caribbean, for example, the temperature in the magazines, whilst relatively speaking much cooler than most other places on the ship, is still going to probably end up being a few degrees higher than it is on a ship sitting in Scapa Flow. And if you're the French Navy, a ship sitting quietly refrigerating its ammunition in Toulon, is that magazine temperature is going to be higher than the same ship if it was sitting in Cherbourg over the course of a given year. And then you take into account the different mixes of cordite. As we mentioned in that video, the Royal Navy had a number of instructions that have survived that talk about the different mixtures of cordite from the very first mixture all the way through to the latest mixture at the time of World War I, and in the case of one document, the 1920s. And they are very clear about the fact that they are aware of nitroglycerin dust sweating out, and they are aware that it happens at different temperatures with the different mixes of cordite. The later mixes of cordite, it happens much more rarely, but the early mixes of cordite, the temperature at which that occurs is much closer to a temperature that you could actually theoretically have occur in a ship's magazine, which is obviously not particularly brilliant. And when you talk about the different load conditions, whilst having fewer or more charges is not really going to make that much of an effect, the fact that you are reducing or increasing the number of charges may have an effect, because that's obviously going to jostle things around somewhat. John Kramer asks, with regards to nitroglycerin dust in the turret, if that was the case, would not firing your guns in that turret be sufficient to set off the dust? Well, I was actually talking to another subscriber who is also a highly qualified chemist about this a couple of days before I started recording this, and it's rather interesting. He pointed out something that is fairly obvious on the face of it, but only obvious once you really think about it, which is that a chemistry lab is a clean room. So nitroglycerin dust that forms in a chemistry lab falls into a clean room surface, will then eventually sublimate into the air and cause all sorts of interesting problems. A turret or a shell room, etc., is not a clean room surface by any stretch of the imagination. There is going to be more regular dust, grease, oil, etc., etc. So nitroglycerin dust that forms and is then shaken loose into the turret environment or a magazine environment, etc., is going to combine with a whole load of other stuff So it's not going to be pure nitroglycerin anymore. It's going to be combined and adhered to all sorts of other things, which still will render it flammable - explosive, but maybe just not quite as detonation or shock sensitive as pure nitroglycerin. You kind of see this when Gunner Grant collects the dust from the magazines, and he's able to ignite it, and it burns very, very fiercely and very readily, but it doesn't explode when he's just sweeping it into a pan, because it's combined, say, with hair and other regular dust and so forth. Sorry about the slight whining you might hear in the background. Poor little floppy dog is asking for attention. A typical programmer asks, in the historical strategy computer game Shogun 2 Total War, set in 16th century Japan, so early in the Age of Sail, the player can buy European ships, presumably Portuguese carracks. Is that realistic for the time period? Did the European powers in the Age of Sail sell warships to non-European powers? It's somewhat realistic in that the Japanese obviously came into contact with mostly Dutch at this period trade ships, and some Portuguese stuff as well. And once they saw them, well, the Japanese weren't stupid. They figured they wanted some of those. And so they did actually build some European-style ships of their own. This is a painting of one with its captain or owner. They then also looked at modifying some of their own native ship design. So you got these kind of hybrids which used existing Japanese ship technology, but also with elements of European ship technology. So, yeah, broadly speaking, the idea that you can buy a European ship in the game, bearing in mind that obviously when you buy almost any of the ships, they're coming in from your own shipyards. Yeah, that's vaguely plausible. If I was going to add anything, I would add those kind of hybrid, very clearly Japanese but European influenced ships to the game. And then, of course, in Shogun, you can also buy ironclads, which is a little unrealistic. Well, it's not entirely unrealistic, to be perfectly honest. You couldn't buy HMS Warrior at the time because, well, the British weren't going to sell you HMS Warrior, but Japan did fairly rapidly industrialise and did actually buy a number of ironclads, one or two of which are actually represented in the game itself. Meta Knight asks, "Hey Drac, how does Yamato's poor quality of steel actually affect Yamato's armour? Every crazed fanboy brings this up as a point to say that their favourite ship had better armour than Yamato, but various actual naval historians, such as Ryan on Battleship New Jersey's channel, have clarified that Yamato's steel quality only made a slight difference to its overall effective thickness. There is some effect, but as Ryan clarified, it's not the absolutely colossal effect you might otherwise think. So in some ways this goes almost all the way back to things like katana. One of the reasons people seem to obsess over katana is like, oh yes, katana folded 10,000 times somehow magically makes it better. Well, actually, no. Kind of, but also no. One of the main reasons that you fold steel so many times, or iron, or whatever you're making your katana out of, depending on the time period, a bit of both, is that, yeah, frankly, Japanese iron ore sucks. It has loads of impurities compared to some other sources of iron. And if you are then trying to smelt iron or steel out of it, then you're going to have a lot more impurities left over. And those impurities can be focal points of stress and weakness, which can then cause a sword to break. And one of the ways that you ensure that your blade doesn't break is by folding the steel over and over and over and over and over again, which means that any weaknesses you might have in any particular portion of the steel that you haven't been able to eradicate are only to be found in a couple of layers, in multiple layers of steel, and roughly speaking evenly distributed down the sword. So there's no particularly overall weak point, but lots of very, very minor weak points, which overall improves the durability. Now, how does that affect battleships, fast forwarding a few hundred years? Well, the baseline material that they have to work with, assuming that they're using Japanese iron and steel, is objectively worse. So you might think, well, that would make the armour objectively worse. But the thing is, any iron or steel that iron that you bring out of the ground and then turn into steel, in the very basic processes, is going to have occlusions and impurities and so on and so forth. It's just a matter of percentages. The gap between steel that's just come out of a basic Bessemer furnace and steel that you use to armour the size of your ship is huge. It's an absolutely huge gulf that you have to cross through quite a lot of refinement and forging and cooling and heating and tempering and annealing and all sorts of things. And during this process, which also actually includes the introduction of impurities like chromium and molybdenum and things like this, all of that will work out the unwanted impurities to a greater or lesser degree, depending on how refined and how controlled you are in your process. And the Japanese, again, they weren't stupid. They knew they were working with some pretty poor quality base materials, and they did their level best to extract the negative impurities from there. And so by the time they've finished the production of their ship's armour, they've eliminated a good chunk of those impurities. So the baseline material, sure, they're starting off from a worse place. They have to do more work to get to the equivalent place that someone using British or American or German steel might have to. But they are capable of getting there, or getting there within a few percentage points. At the stage that you've got 16-inch thick face-hardened armour as you have with Yamato, it's very, 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 very minorly about the overall quality of the baseline steel, and actually significantly more about the overall quality and a level of advancement in your process of manufacture. Because everybody, although they broadly use the same process to produce crop-style face-hardened steel, they all do it slightly differently, and some people do it better than others in terms of quality control, some do it better than others in terms of overall results, and so on and so forth. So whilst overall, yes, Yamato's steel in its final state is not quite to the same level as some of the best armour steel that you were going to find from one or two of the other nations, it's still reasonably close. So pretty much as you indicated, as Ryan said, Yamato's armour, if you like using somewhat arbitrary figures, if it's 16 inches thick, it may be the equivalent of 15 or 15 and a half inches or something like that of somebody else's armour steel, and the best quality armour steel, if it was made 16 inches thick, might be equivalent to 17, 18 inches of standard armour steel, whichever you choose to be the standard for the period. But it's not the kind of thing where you could go, yes, well, me with my 12 inches of armour is better than the 16 inches. That's not the case. Your 12 inches of armour might be equivalent to, again, using somewhat arbitrary figures, but to get the general point across, might be equivalent to maybe 13 or 13 and a half inches of Japanese armour. But the Japanese armour might be equivalent to, let's say, 14 and a half, 15 inches of your own armour, but that still leaves Yamato, from a thickness equivalent perspective, better protected. It's just not quite as better protected as the 4-inch gap between 12 and 16-inch might suggest, but the variables are relatively minimal unless you're considering the absolute best quality face-hardened steel armour versus the absolute worst quality face-hardened steel armour of the Second World War period. Cisco Fan asks, I've heard from another historian recently who was insisting that there are multiple computer models that prove Hood could only be sunk by Prinz Eugen, and it is impossible for Bismarck to sink it in the way that it did, and that the narrative that Bismarck sunk Hood is only continued to be perpetuated because neither the UK nor Germany want to admit the truth. Do you know if these models exist, and if they do, is that what they say, and is there any merit to them? Well, if there are such computer models, nobody's shown them to me, and I've not heard of any such definitive models. I've included the slightly absurd, apparently the Germans had high-angle mortars picture here, because essentially there are two lines of thought I've seen as far as Prinz Eugen's shells are concerned. The first of which
seems to think that Prinz Eugen's shells were capable of penetrating Hood's armour. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Certainly not at the ranges that were involved in the battle. Maybe if they were side by side in port or something like that. But people also seem to misapprehend that just because Prinz Eugen had to fire her guns at a higher elevation than Bismarck to reach out to the range that Hood was at, that doesn't mean they were coming in like this. Depending on exactly what range you think Hood and Bismarck and Prinz Eugen were at the last stage of the Battle of Denmark Strait, you're looking at, for most estimates, Prinz Eugen would have her guns elevated at, rather more accurately, the shells would be falling, which is the relevant part, at somewhere in the mid to high teens, and for some of the closer ranges, the lower teens of angles, which, it's a few degrees, anything from 3 to just over half a dozen degrees more than Bismarck, but it's fundamentally still a horizontal impact. It's not plunging fire into the deck. And the other one that I've seen a fair bit with relation to Prinz Eugen is claiming that Hood was detonated by a delayed effect of the hit that set fire to the boat deck, which we do know happened. However, there are a few problems with that. The supposition somehow being that there was petrol on the boats or somewhere in the vicinity of the boat deck, which, combined with some ready-use ammunition, eventually percolated its way down into the magazines and set them off. But as I said, there are a couple of big problems with this. The single largest one being that the boat deck isn't over the magazines. The boat deck is over the engine rooms and actually quite far forward ahead of the machineries, ahead of the magazines and over the machinery spaces. Secondly, whatever it was, presumably burning fuel, would have to transit down. If you're getting into the engine spaces, you have to transit down through 5 separate decks. If you want to get down to the magazines, you have to go through 6 separate decks, including at least 2 armoured decks. And in the case of if you want to get this burning fuel to the magazines, you've also got to transit backwards by, depending on exactly where on the boat deck you think all of this was coming from, something approximating 40 to 70 frames of the ship, which is a fair distance for anyone who's, been on a large vessel. And again, if anyone's either served on a large vessel or just been on a large museum ship vessel or even a mid-sized museum ship vessel, another thing you'll know about warship decks is that you don't just have holes in the floor for the hatches and you don't just have doors in the bulkheads to walk through. Anything substantial will usually have the hatch raised off of the deck by anything from an inch to several inches, and all of the bulkhead doors and hatches, they will be set into the bulkhead in such a way that, again, it's usually about 6 inches or more above the deck, which can result in a lot of bashed knees and ankles if you're not used to it. And the main purpose of this is that if you end up with water ingress, then a small amount of water ingress can't just flood straight along the ship. It has to build up a relatively substantial amount before it can either overtop an open hatch or a broken hatch, if indeed the hatch is opened or compromised in any way, or in the case of a doorway, obviously it's got to build up, the surface area of the flooded area, which can be quite substantial, multiplied by, again, at least 6 or more inches, which is a lot of water by volume, and then it will reach the lower lip of the door. And at that point, again, if the door has been left open or has been in some way compromised, it can flow through. Now, what's the point of me telling you about watertight subdivision? Well, Hood was closed up for action, so any suggestion that burning fuel somehow made it down into the magazine is to suggest that a relatively small quantity of fuel somehow maneuvered itself over about 100 feet horizontally and, as I said, down about 6 decks, somehow compromising multiple hatches, all of which would have been sealed, as I said earlier, at least 2 armour decks, plus the fire prevention measures in the magazines themselves, which is basically nonsensical, because even if by some absolute miracle of sheer incompetence Hood's crew had left every single hatchway and doorway open, every single gallon of fuel present on the boat deck, even if you allow for a couple of holes in a few decks of the upper decks punched by some shell explosions, all of that fuel combined would not be enough to actually build up to a height level that could actually flow through a single doorway. And, you know, that even if either through splinter damage, shell damage, or again, massively compromised safety and somehow all the hatches are left open, Hood's hatches don't all run vertically down in one line. They're offset from each other. But even if all of that, so let's say that whatever shell set off the boat deck magically also punched through 3 or 4 decks before inevitably detonating on the armor deck. Being an 8-inch shell, this isn't going to really accomplish all that much. But even then, this is our best case scenario. Okay, so we have several dozen gallons of burning fuel hypothetically able to fall in a burning cascade through to the armor deck above the machinery spaces, at which point it's just going to sit there and do what exactly? It can't flow the 100 feet further back it needs and the other 2 decks further down to reach into the magazines. It's physically not possible. So yeah, and the tangential one, again, which is something I discussed in my video on why Hood sank, there's a tangential one to that has been, oh, well, maybe the fuel managed to get down to the torpedo tubes and set those off. Well, I discussed in the video why, A, that's still not going to reach the magazines, and B, very unlikely to happen anyway. But, you know, look at where the torpedo tubes are. Again, relatively speaking, quite far forward. The torpedo tubes are about 35, 40 frames forward of the 4-inch magazines, let alone the 15-inch magazines. So, yeah, unless we're talking about Prinz Eugen shell arriving at pretty much the same point that I identified for Bismarck shell, then it's not going to happen. And on top of that, you have the additional problem of, even if Prinz Eugen shell drops neatly into the trough, you have the fact that, well, the hit that was observed came with a salvo from Bismarck, and also the fact that Prinz Eugen shell will be coming in at a different angle and with significantly less penetration, and is therefore significantly less likely to actually make it substantially inside the ship, even without armor in place to stop it. So yeah, I personally find it highly unlikely, but as I said, no one's indicated to me any of these models, so if anyone knows where these models are or the results of them, then please feel free to let us know so I can have a look over them and see what they say. Nathaporn Hong Sharon asks, what exactly was the differences between Dunkerque and Strasbourg's armour scheme? So Strasbourg didn't receive any less armour than Dunkerque, which is why she came out somewhat heavier. All areas of armour on Strasbourg were maintained at either the same level as Dunkerque or thicker. Now, in terms of which parts of Strasbourg were thicker, the turret faceplates were a bit thicker, as were the main turret barbettes. Plus, you also had a thicker belt, which is usually the big ticket item that most people look at, because Dunkerque's belt was near enough makes no difference 9 inches thick, whilst Strasbourg's was a little over 11 inches, and both of those belts were inclined, so the effectiveness is slightly higher than it might otherwise seem just from paper stats. Also, you have the bulkheads, which enclose the belt and form the citadel area on all ships, and Strasbourg's bulkheads were a bit thicker than Dunkerque's. And then finally, you also have one of the ship's 2 armoured decks. So the Dunkerque armour scheme was a fairly regular all-or-nothing scheme, all things told. The upper armour deck, the one that caps off and forms a citadel box, is the same on both ships, but there's also a thinner, substantially thinner, lower turtleback style armour deck interior to the citadel, and that's not designed in and of itself to stop anything substantial that's managed to get through, but what it is designed to do, both in terms of layout and thickness, is to stop splinters and fragments that might have gone through, or bits of armour that have spalled off the inside from a hit. And on Strasbourg, the sloped elements of that were made slightly thicker. Daniel asks, how were the countless sea mines placed during the World Wars removed? Were many missed since the other side placed them? And are missed ones still a danger today? It depends on how they're laid as to how disposing of them is approached. Now, if they are laid by traditional mine layers, on which can be military vessels, converted civilian vessels, or whatever, then the navies usually have a relatively decent idea about where they are. If they've been laid by submarines, they have a somewhat decent idea of where they are, although it's not going to be as exact as if it was laid by a ship. Plus, also, you might have the problem of the knowledge being lost if, say, a mine layer sub goes out, lays some mines, and is subsequently sunk on the same mission, or possibly on a mission shortly thereafter, maybe when the crew hasn't had the time to submit absolutely everything they know about where those mines went. And then the least precise version is airdrop mines, because even in the best of circumstances, when the aircraft isn't being shot at by defensive fighters, you're lobbing a several hundred up to several £1,000 lump of explosives and metal into the water from a fairly substantial altitude. You have a vague idea that it's landed in an approximate area of, let's say, a bay or a stretch of coastline, but you don't know exactly where. And as well, obviously on air raids, you do tend to lose some aircraft. So from a record-keeping perspective, if you send out, let's say, a dozen aircraft, a dozen bombers equipped with mines, and only 8 of them come back, so you've lost 4, well, where did you lose those 4? You might know, but did you lose them before they dropped their mines? After they dropped their mines? Did they jettison their mines in an effort to get away? So on and so forth. You may not actually know this, at least for 1 or 2 of them. Multiply that by the number of mine-dropping missions the aircraft did, and all of a sudden you have a vague idea of roughly how many mines should be out there and roughly where they should be, but that's a very approximate value. You're still marking, here be mines, this kind of thing. Post-war, it's in everybody's interest to ensure that the mines are removed. So post-war, everybody shared as much data as they could when it came to where their mines were, and mine sweeping missions were conducted in fairly short order. Now, the fortunate thing is that, again, in theory, because you want the mines to be in approximately a location where enemy shipping is likely to be and not wandering with the vagaries of the currents, mines tend to be anchored in some way, shape, or form to the local seabed, or sometimes with sea anchors, although that's very rare. That's usually more by accident. And so the mine should be there. So then you can run mine sweeps, paravanes, etc., sever the cables or the chains or whatever, and up they come to the surface. You can dispose of them. Happy days. The problem comes if you drop a mine in slightly too deep water and the anchor, the cable or the chain doesn't run out far enough so the anchor can't actually anchor itself to the seabed, or there's a storm or something else that causes a mine to snap its chain or its tether and go wandering off merrily with the current. So the bulk of mines usually can be swept in the post-war environment, although even then there are casualties when the occasional minesweeping exercise doesn't quite sweep as many mines as it thought it had and runs into one. But the big risk is when the mines go off on their own, because you can sweep the area where they should be, and you won't find any, and you'll think, right, great, that's clear. And yes, it may be clear then, and then seasonal currents might bring mines back. Or seasonal currents might bring mines to completely different areas of the world to cause havoc. And, well, some mines are better built than others. Some mines will eventually fill up with water and sink. Others, the explosives upon getting damp might become inert over periods. Others will just happily bob along until they find something and remain lethal the entire time. So, for example, little known fact, during the evacuations associated with the end of the Vietnam War, US warships off of the Vietnamese coast were having to keep a sharp eye out for mines that had been dropped by the US Army Air Force, as it was at the time, off of the Japanese coast at the end of World War II, because a substantial number of those had parted company with their anchors and had decided to bob around. And for some reason best explained by oceanographers, a whole bunch of them had fetched up off of the Vietnamese coast almost 20 years later. So, yeah, that could have been a bit of a problem. And yeah, missed ones, as I said, if the explosives remain viable, they can still be a danger. And although it's less common nowadays, even within my lifetime, off of various European coasts, French beaches, German beaches, British beaches, etc., there have occasionally been the odd sea mines that have wandered up and had to be safely disposed of. Alec Hruby asks, when was the first idea of a smokescreen created, and how did they change? And what was their effectiveness throughout the time frame of their existence? Smokescreens seem to have been invented and then disappeared, invented and disappeared, and invented and disappeared, off and on pretty much for as long as there's been recorded naval history in some way, shape or form. They've been in more regular use, more substantially on land for a longer unbroken period of time. But naval-wise, the fits and starts more recently heading into consistent use of smokescreens usually are attributed to the late 18th, early 19th century, with, of course, it's going to be Thomas Cochrane, with his love of pyromania, chemical warfare, and generally just attacking things flying the French or Spanish flags. And he invented a number of different forms of smokescreen, all inspired by ancient stories of using smokescreens, although, as a number of sources point out, and for those of you who are asking about what his proposal was to go after the Russians in the Crimean War as well, bearing in mind that chemical science was not as advanced back then as it is now, he'd just gone, okay, what produces really thick, horrible, toxic clouds of smoke? Well, really thick, horrible clouds of smoke. It turns out that a vast majority of those things that do are rather toxic. Things like pure sulfur. And so whether his proposals for smoke screens would count more as a way of hiding his movements or a way of asphyxiating the enemy whilst also hiding his movements, it's kind of on the fence. Cochrane was a man for whom the term war crimes was something that happened to other people, if he could get away with it. Now, once he left active naval service with the Royal Navy, there's minor experiments with smoke screens across various navies, but nothing really substantial until you get to the American Civil War. Then a couple of blockade runners have this bright idea of using smoke screens to try and obscure them from Union vessels. That doesn't really work out too brilliantly, mainly because there's usually a fair number of Union vessels, and if the blockade runner is going from point A to point B, you generally just have to go, well, where's the tip of the smoke screen going, even if it hides the ship. And then you get into basically the very early 20th century, and at that point, not only have more interesting and slightly less lethal chemicals been introduced, which can both produce a lot more smoke with a lot less toxicity, but the ability to deploy those across various ships has increased as substantially as well. So it's kind of the 1900s, 1910s, that's when you start to see the big increase and deployment of smoke screens, and then their effectiveness in World War I and World War II is relatively well known. Before then, as I said, it had always been just experimental and infrequent, which meant that it's very hard to gauge effectiveness, because even in World War I and World War II, when you're looking at wide-scale and regularly practiced deployments, whether they worked or not could vary hugely depending on local weather conditions and such like. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, during both world wars, how often did U-boats sink neutral ships, and what would happen to the crew if it was found that they had sunk a neutral ship? It depends what time period of the world wars you're looking at. In the first half of the First World War, it was relatively rare, and if it did happen, there would usually be an apology and possibly even a restriction of U-boat activities in that immediate area, maybe. But towards the mid part of the First World War, you then have the Kaiserliche Marine operating a unrestricted warfare policy. So previously, U-boats had been expected to follow cruiser rules, so you have to stop, inspect, make sure it's not neutral, then sink it. With the advent of unrestricted warfare, everything within stated areas could and was sunk, or people at least attempted to sink them, which meant that, you know, if a neutral vessel was heading roughly in a direction, either in the direction of Britain or later on in pretty much any direction, it could very well end up just being sunk. So obviously neutral sinkings increased quite substantially. And then in World War II, it was pretty much unrestricted submarine warfare right from the beginning. So unless it was in waters where you could be pretty much absolutely sure that there was no enemy presence. So, for example, the Germans weren't going to send U-boats to sink neutral Swedish iron ore boats in the Baltic because, well, one, they were the customers for most of those boats, and secondly, you know, the chances of there being any British trade going on in the Baltic in World War II were pretty slim. But if you were a neutral ship in the North Sea or a neutral ship out in the Atlantic, etc., it was pretty much as dangerous for you as it was for a ship flying the red ensign of the British Merchant Navy. And as far as what would happen to the crew if it was found that the U-boat had sunk a neutral ship, well, during unrestricted U-boat warfare, nothing. And in the early part of the war, of World War I, that is, there may be some reprimand, but only if there was an investigation period, and if that investigation showed that they'd been exceptionally negligent in misidentifying the ship in question. Vintage Car History asks, in the US Navy back when I was a sailor, there were a list of pranks that we'd pull on new shipmates fresh from boot camp, sending them to get a mast crank, a bucket of prop wash, or sending them to CIC to bring back some contacts, etc. Are there any pranks that are particular to the Royal Navy or to other navies? So in no particular order, these are the ones I've heard of, or at least the ones I've heard of that I can remember. Sending people to look for a tin of striped paint. Apparently, that I think that's fairly common across a lot of people playing pranks. Also, sending people looking for straight sky hooks. For those of you who don't know, in the Royal Navy, at least in the modern era, a sky hook is kind of an S-shaped piece of metal that's used to hang damage control cables. So, yeah, and a straight sky hook would be a kind of a foot-long strip of metal. Why on earth you'd have some of those on a ship, I don't know, but that's the point. Putting people on basin watch, which is ostensibly to make sure that when the ship powers up and disconnects from shore supplies, that it doesn't somehow change the pressure in the water main system and cause all the basins in the toilets to leak, which then leads to a very bemused young sailor standing in the ship's heads, intently watching the washing basins. Green and red oil, which is of course necessary for your port and starboard running lights. High or low frequency grease, bit for the radar, because of course most ships have at least 2 radar installations. So if you've got, and if someone comes back with 1 pot of grease, you say, no, this is the wrong frequency grease. We need the other frequency grease. So those are the somewhat common ones, which may or may not be unique to the Royal Navy, but certainly have been played on Royal Navy ships. And I also heard a fair number that have been specifically in relation to Gibraltar. For example, assigning people to monkey watch to make sure that those dastardly Gibraltar monkeys don't get on board the ships, which of course they don't because they live right up on the rock, and they know better anyway. And another one was also generating an entire fake currency, because, of course, for those of you who don't know, Gibraltar is actually technically part of the UK, much like somewhere like the Falkland Islands, etc. So British pounds are perfectly acceptable currency in Gibraltar. But if you're a young naive sailor and you don't know any better, then a bunch of your shipmates might relieve you of some actual currency and give you some rather questionable Gibraltar currency, which you will only find is not actually valid currency when you step ashore, by which point presumably they've spent it all. And finally for this week, Greg M asks, what was the idea behind the wide variety of guns on pre-Dreadnought battleships? Or put it another way, why didn't an all-big gunship get built sooner? The idea for the multiple different types of guns essentially arose from the naval arms race. So people were adding more and more armour to their ships, and then later, once Harvey steel and then Krupp steel, well, compound armour before that as well, meant that you could get even more resistance. They slimmed down the amount of armour in some cases, but still got more resistance, but then the thickness of armour started going up again. So essentially, armour's resistive power was increasing. In order to break through that armour, therefore, you needed considerably larger guns with considerably more power. The problem was, as you had more and more guns, or more larger guns, I should say, you couldn't have many of them because they were really big and heavy. And then you end up with having 2, 3, or 4 single large weapons, or maybe you have 4 and you stick them in twin turrets or something like that. So you're down to a very, very small number of large guns. But for the majority of the latter part of the 19th century, once they get up to this size, your ability to reload them is relatively minimal. You're talking in terms of minutes per round, not rounds per minute. Unfortunately, these are still the only guns that you can get that can break the armour of an enemy ship, so you have to carry them. But in order to keep your armour thick enough to repel similar enemy rounds, you can't cover the entire ship with massive thicknesses of armour. And so someone thought, well, if we can't easily break the main armour, and bear in mind, if you shoot your 1 salvo every 5 minutes, that's still not necessarily guaranteeing you're going to hit. They thought, well, if we put some smaller guns on, whether that be 6-inch, 7-inch, 8-inch, something around that kind of calibre, well, these are smaller, we can carry more of them, and we can fire them considerably faster than the main guns. And the enemy has all these exposed positions, spotting tops, the bridge, the superstructure, the fore and aft ends, etc. And if we can reduce the enemy's fighting capacity by crippling his command crew, crippling his ability to see, admitting water, crippling the steering, etc., just generally bringing water into the ship, then that will mean the enemy is slowed down, maybe unable to shoot back quite as accurately, and that means that we, A, won't get shot at quite as much by the enemy's big heavy shells, and B, we can close in a degree of safety and make sure that our big heavy shells actually definitively finish this thing off. And that's where you get the secondary battery. Subsequently, people obviously invented the torpedo boat, and all of a sudden they were looking at things and going, well, even our secondary battery, even a 6-inch gun at this stage, still can't fire fast enough to take out these small, fast-attacking craft. So we're going to need something that's even smaller and has an even higher fire rate to guarantee being able to hose down these, well, at the time, relatively tiny torpedo boats. Hence, you see 1-pounders, 2-pounders, 3-pounders, 6-pounders, etc., or 37mm, 47mm, 57mm, or 75mm guns. They suddenly start to proliferate. And of course, these things are now too small to have any form of fire control, rudimentary as fire control is in the latter part of the 19th century. So you have to have a lot of them. They have to cover a large area. And of course, because their rounds are relatively small, that's another reason to have a lot of them, because you need to hit an enemy boat, even a small torpedo boat, multiple times. And then, of course, some torpedo boats are larger, some torpedo boats are smaller, then some bright spots are, well, if we've got all these weapons at very close ranges, we could hose down the enemy battleships or cruisers as well. And then somebody else points out, yes, but enemy cruisers aren't quite as well armoured, so maybe our secondary battery could also be an anti-cruiser battery. And then somebody else goes, yes, but some of our anti-torpedo boat guns, even against a protected cruiser, might be quite useful, but then there's too few of them and they're too slow firing to guarantee we can take out the torpedo boat, so we need to introduce yet another battery of even lighter anti-torpedo boat guns. And all these various demands, which essentially come down to the lack of guns in the latter part of the 19th century to track, aim, and fire quickly and accurately enough, end up with pre-Dreadnoughts that will have at minimum 3, sometimes as many as 6 or 7 different batteries of guns for a huge variety of purposes. And part of what makes the all-big gunship possible is not just that the guns themselves, the big guns at least, have gotten considerably longer and can fire significantly quicker, and have now fire control systems allowing them to exploit their significantly greater range, which then means that all the smaller guns are significantly outranged, but also quick firing technology, which starts at the very low level and works its way up, which doesn't really go much beyond the secondary battery for a while, although versions of it will work their way into the main battery guns, which is why they drop to rounds per minute instead of minutes per round. But anyway, the 4, 5, 6-inch batteries now can fire like a dozen plus rounds a minute, which means if you can get a reasonable number of those on, you now have something that is viable against enemy cruisers, can now fire rapidly enough to be viable against enemy destroyers, and maybe, just maybe, might be decent at smashing up enemy capital ships at short to medium range if necessary. But to be honest, you've got enough main guns, that's probably not going to be too much of an issue. At which stage you then see battleships briefly go back to just having 2 batteries, a main battery and a secondary battery, and then aircraft come along and ruin the nice simplicity of it all. And that brings us to an end for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Just a quick reminder, it's about 2 weeks or so until I head out to Australia, so the ShipShape crowdfunder to help with that is linked in the description below. Other than that, thanks for listening, and see you again in another video.